There are moments in life when a man loses everything that matters, and in that darkness he becomes something the world should fear. In the winter of 1887, Caleb Thorne knelt beside his wife's grave in the frozen Wyoming wilderness, whispering a final promise to the only woman he'd ever loved. 20 armed riders surrounded his cabin that night, sent by a powerful rancher to force him off his land. They thought they were dealing with a broken man too consumed by grief to fight back. They were wrong. What happened in the next few hours would be whispered about in saloons and around campfires for decades to come. This is the story of how one man's promise to his dying wife changed an entire valley. What did he do that left 20 hardened gunmen frozen in their tracks? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe. Tomorrow's story is unforgettable. 3 years before that frozen morning, Caleb Thorne had arrived in the Wyoming mountains with little more than a pack mule, a Winchester rifle, and a heart tired of violence. He was 42 then, lean and weathered, with grey threading through his dark beard and lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years and harder choices. He'd spent 2 decades as an army scout in the territories, tracking hostile war parties and guiding cavalry columns through country that would swallow men whole if they didn't respect it. He knew how to read sign that other men couldn't see, how to move through wilderness without leaving a trace, and how to survive where survival seemed impossible. But he'd also seen enough death to last several lifetimes, the kind of death that followed orders and strategy, that claimed good men and bad men alike, that left women widowed and children fatherless. After the last campaign, after burying too many friends in shallow graves across the plains, Caleb had turned in his scout's pay and ridden north into the mountains. He wanted silence. He wanted solitude. He wanted to build something with his hands instead of destroying things with his skills. The valley he found seemed like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to speak. It sat high in the Wyoming Rockies, sheltered by pine-covered ridges that blocked the worst of the winter winds. A clear creek ran through it year-round, cold and pure, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Elk and deer moved through the meadows. Trout filled the pools. The soil, where you could find it between the rocks, was rich enough for a garden if you worked it right. He'd spent that first summer building a cabin in a small clearing where the creek made a gentle bend. The work was hard and honest, exactly what he needed. He felled logs, notched them, fitted them together with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to prove. The cabin wasn't large, just one main room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace he'd built rock by careful rock. But every timber was straight, every corner was square, and when the first snow fell that October, the cabin stood solid and warm against the cold. He carved the front door himself during the long winter nights, working by firelight with a knife and patience. He carved pine boughs along the frame and a mountain peak above the lintel, and his initials at the bottom where they wouldn't show unless you looked for them. It was the kind of detail a man put into something when he meant it to last, when he was building not just shelter, but a home. That first winter passed in quiet solitude. Caleb trapped marten and beaver, hunted elk when he needed meat, and spent the evenings reading the few books he'd brought with him. He talked to himself sometimes, just to hear a human voice, but mostly he learned to appreciate the silence. The wind in the pines, the crack of ice on the creek, the distant howl of wolves echoing off the peaks. These sounds didn't demand anything from him. They didn't require him to make choices that would haunt him later. He thought he might live out his years this way, alone and peaceful, until the day Sarah Brennan rode into his valley on a borrowed horse, lost and looking for the settlement she'd been hired to teach in. She was 28 years old, raised in Boston, educated at a women's seminary, and completely unprepared for the realities of frontier life. She'd taken a wrong turn 20 miles back and had been wandering for 2 days, surviving on the dried apples in her saddlebag and the stubborn belief that she couldn't possibly be as lost as she appeared to be. Caleb found her at the edge of his meadow, trying to coax her exhausted horse across the creek. She wore a grey travelling dress that was torn in 3 places, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in tangles around her face. But when she saw him, she didn't scream or faint the way some Eastern women might have. She just straightened her shoulders and said, "I don't suppose you know the way to Millbrook Settlement?" He did know, though it pained him to tell her. Millbrook was 40 miles west, over 2 mountain passes that would be dangerous even for an experienced rider. The settlement itself was barely a settlement at all, just a handful of homesteaders trying to scratch farms out of rocky soil. The man who'd hired her had been optimistic about the school he promised, but Caleb knew there were maybe 6 children in the whole area, scattered across miles of rough country. He should have given her directions and sent her on her way. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. Instead, he offered her supper and a place to sleep in his barn, told her the horse needed rest before attempting those passes. She accepted with a tired smile that did something strange to his chest, something he hadn't felt in more years than he cared to count. She stayed for supper. Then she stayed another day because her horse had thrown a shoe and Caleb needed to file a new one. Then she stayed a 3rd day because a storm rolled in and the passes would be impassable. By the 4th day, they both knew she wasn't leaving. They talked during those days, long conversations by the fireplace, while wind howled outside and snow piled against the cabin walls. Sarah told him about Boston, about her family who thought she'd lost her mind coming west, about the books she'd read that made her believe she could make a difference out here. She talked about teaching, about how education was the key to building real civilization, about her dream of a school where every child could learn to read and write and think for themselves. Caleb talked about things he'd never told anyone, about the violence he'd seen and the violence he'd done, about the friends he'd buried and the choices that still woke him in the night, about why he'd come to these mountains, looking for something he couldn't name. Sarah listened without judgment, without fear, and when he finished, she said simply, "You're not running away, Caleb. You're running toward. You just hadn't found what you were looking for yet." 3 months later, they were married by a traveling circuit preacher who happened through the valley. They stood on the cabin porch at sunrise, with fresh snow on the peaks and the creek singing its endless song, and promised to love each other through whatever came. Caleb carved their names into the doorframe that night, below his initials, making it official in his own way. Sarah never made it to Millbrook. She sent word that she'd found a better situation, which was true in every way that mattered. She did teach, though. Homesteaders were scattered throughout the surrounding valleys, families who'd claimed small parcels of land and were trying to build futures for their children. Sarah sought them out, riding the mountain trails with Caleb as guide, carrying books and slates and an inexhaustible belief that every child deserved a chance to learn. She taught in their cabins, sometimes just 1 or 2 children at a time, sometimes gathering several families together in a barn or meadow when weather allowed. She taught them to read and write, to cipher numbers, to think about the world beyond their small holdings. She gave them books to keep, precious volumes she'd brought from Boston or ordered from catalogues with the little money she and Caleb could spare. The homesteaders loved her for it. They would have given her anything they had, but they had so little to give. So they gave what they could: smoked venison, sacks of beans, jars of preserves, hand-knitted socks. They gave their gratitude and their friendship, and Sarah treasured these gifts more than gold. For 3 years, Caleb and Sarah built a life together in that high valley. They worked hard, lived simply, and found a contentment that neither had expected to know. Caleb hunted and trapped and kept the cabin in good repair. Sarah taught and tended her garden and filled the cabin with warmth and laughter. On winter evenings, they sat by the fire and read to each other. On summer nights, they walked down to the creek and listened to the water flowing toward distant plains they no longer cared to see. It was a good life, a quiet life, the kind of life that men like Caleb dreamed about during long campaigns but never quite believed they'd find. And for 3 precious years, it was theirs. Then the valley changed. Word spread about the grazing land, the timber, the water rights. Men with money and ambition began to take notice, and at the center of that ambition was Marcus Drummond, who owned a sprawling ranch to the east and believed that everything he could see from his porch should belong to him. The sickness came in the late autumn of their 3rd year together, quiet at first, like everything else in the mountains. Sarah caught a chill after riding through an early snow to reach a homesteader family 20 miles north. She'd insisted on going despite the weather, despite Caleb's warnings, because little Emma Patterson was finally starting to read full sentences, and Sarah didn't want the girl to lose her momentum. She came home shivering and pale, and Caleb made her hot tea with honey and wrapped her in every blanket they owned. She laughed at his fussing, told him she'd survived Boston winters that would make Wyoming look mild. But the cough that started that night didn't sound like something that would pass with rest and warm drinks. Within a week, she was fevered. Within 2 weeks, she could barely leave the bed. Caleb rode hard to the nearest settlement with a doctor, a 2-day journey each way through mountain passes already thick with snow. The doctor came, a tired old man who'd seen too much frontier illness and knew the limits of his skill. He examined Sarah, listened to her labored breathing, and gave Caleb a bottle of medicine with instructions to administer it twice daily. "Keep her warm," the doctor said, packing his bag with hands that trembled slightly. "Keep her drinking water. The fever needs to break, and soon, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Caleb paid the doctor with every dollar he had saved, plus 2 prime beaver pelts and a promise of more furs come spring. The doctor accepted with a sad nod that told Caleb he didn't expect to collect on that promise. The medicine seemed to help at first. Sarah's fever dropped, and for 3 hopeful days she could sit up and take broth and even smile at Caleb's awkward attempts to recreate her cooking. But then the fever returned, worse than before, and the cough that came with it was deep and wet and terrifying. Caleb tried everything. He kept the fire roaring, kept her wrapped and warm. He made her drink water even when she was too weak to hold the cup. He read to her from her favorite books, hoping his voice might anchor her to the world when her mind wandered in fever dreams. He prayed, though he wasn't sure he believed in prayer, because it was the only thing left he hadn't tried. On the 12th night, during a blizzard that shook the cabin walls and piled snow 6 feet high against the door, Sarah's fever finally broke. But instead of the relief Caleb had prayed for, he saw something worse in her eyes when they opened. She knew. Somehow, she knew. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind outside. "Come here. Sit with me." He pulled the chair close to the bed, took her hand in both of his. Her skin was cold now, too cold, and her fingers felt fragile as bird bones. The fire cast dancing shadows across her face, making her look like a ghost already. "I need you to promise me something," she said. "Anything." His voice cracked on the word. "The families in the valley, the children I've been teaching." She paused, gathering strength for each word. "Drummond's men have been visiting them, threatening them, trying to force them off their land." Caleb felt ice in his stomach. He'd heard rumors, distant talk from trappers passing through, but he'd been too focused on Sarah's illness to investigate. "I didn't know it had gotten that bad. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd do something dangerous." A faint smile touched her lips. "You've worked so hard to leave violence behind. I didn't want to pull you back into it. Sarah, listen to me." She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "Those families need protection. The children need a future. Everything I've been teaching them, all those hours and all those books, it won't matter if Drummond drives them away. They'll scatter, and their children will grow up without learning to read, without knowing they can be more than what circumstances make them. You're going to be fine," Caleb said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "You'll teach them yourself. You'll—" "Caleb," she said his name gently, the way she did when he was being stubborn about something obvious. "We both know that's not true, so I need you to promise me." Promise you'll protect them, not with violence unless you must, but with your presence, your strength. Let them know they're not alone against Drummond's threats. Tears blurred his vision. I promise. I swear it on everything I am. There's more. She was fading now, her voice growing softer. I've been keeping something from you. A journal. It's in my trunk, under the winter quilts. I've been writing down everything. Every family, every child, their progress, their dreams. I've also been documenting Drummond's threats, the things his men have said and done. It's all there. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was going to handle it myself. I thought if I could just organize the homesteaders, help them understand their legal rights, they could resist without violence. She coughed, a terrible rattling sound. But I'm running out of time for that plan. Caleb pressed her hand to his cheek, feeling his tears wet against her cold fingers. You should rest. Save your strength. I've been saving my strength for this conversation. She managed to turn her head to look at him fully. A place where families build homes, and children learn, and people help each other survive. That's what I wanted. That's what I still want, even if I won't see it. You will see it. Promise me you'll make it happen. Not just protect the families, but build something lasting. A real community. Maybe even a school someday. A place where what I started can continue. I promise, he said again, the words coming from somewhere deeper than thought. I promise on my life, on our life together. I'll make your dream real. Sarah smiled then, a true smile that reminded him of the woman who'd ridden into his valley 3 years ago with tangled hair and stubborn hope. I knew I could trust you. From that first day, even when you were trying so hard to be a hermit, I knew you had a good heart. You should rest now, Caleb said, though he wanted to keep talking, wanted to hold on to every remaining moment. Will you read to me? From Whitman. The poem, about the open road. He retrieved the book from the shelf, his hands trembling as he found the page. He read to her in the firelight while the blizzard raged outside, his voice steady despite the tears that ran down into his beard. He read about journeys and companionship, about the long brown path before them, leading wherever they chose. Sarah closed her eyes halfway through, but her breathing continued, shallow and slow. He read through the night, pausing only to add wood to the fire. When dawn came grey and cold through the snow-covered window, he was still reading, still holding her hand. She died as the first light touched the peaks above the valley. There was no struggle, no final gasping breath. She simply stopped, as quietly as snow falling, leaving Caleb alone in the cabin they'd built together. He sat with her for a long time, holding her hand as it grew colder, watching the light move across her peaceful face. The storm had passed, and through the window he could see pristine snow covering everything, making the world look clean and new and impossibly empty. Finally, when he could no longer avoid it, he rose and began the work of preparing her body. He washed her gently, dressed her in the blue dress she'd been married in, wrapped her in their wedding quilt. He carried her outside into the brutal cold and began the heartbreaking task of digging a grave in frozen ground. It took him 2 days. The ground was hard as iron, and every shovelful felt like it took an hour. But he dug by hand, refusing to use tools that would have made it easier, but felt too impersonal. This was the last thing he could do for her, and he would do it right. He chose a spot 30 feet from the cabin, under a massive pine where she'd like to sit and read in the summer shade. He dug deep, deeper than necessary, and lined the grave with smooth stones from the creek. When it was finished, he stood for a long moment staring at the hole that would hold everything he'd loved. On the morning of the burial, 3 days after Sarah's death, Caleb carried her wrapped body to the grave. The sky was crystalline blue, the kind of perfect winter day that hurt to look at. He laid her down gently, arranged the quilt around her, and stood at the edge trying to find words for a prayer he didn't know how to speak. That's when he heard the horses. 20 riders coming through the trees, spreading out in a practiced formation, surrounding his cabin and his grief with deliberate, calculated menace. The moon was a thin crescent, giving just enough light to navigate by, but not enough to betray movement. Caleb moved through the forest with the patient silence he'd learned, tracking Apache warriors across the Arizona territory. Each step was deliberate, each footfall placed on frozen ground or bare rock that wouldn't crack or rustle. He became part of the darkness, just another shadow among the pines. It took him an hour to circle around and approach the riders' camp from downwind. They'd chosen their position well enough, on a slight rise with clear views of the cabin, but they'd made mistakes too. The fires were too large, destroying their night vision. They'd posted guards, but the guards were standing near the fires where the warmth was, not out in the darkness where threats would come from. These men were competent, but they'd grown comfortable with intimidating unarmed homesteaders. They weren't prepared for someone who knew how to fight back. Caleb settled into a depression behind a fallen log about 50 yards from the nearest fire. From here, he could see and hear everything without being seen himself. He wrapped his dark coat around himself and became still, patient as stone, while the riders went about their evening routines. There were 4 fires, 5 men around each. The groups had natural divisions that told Caleb about their relationships and hierarchy. One fire had the younger men, loud and boastful, passing a bottle and laughing. Another had older, quieter men who ate their supper in tired silence. The third fire held men who looked harder, more dangerous, the kind who'd done worse than simple intimidation. And the fourth fire, slightly separate from the others, held Virgil Kane and 3 other men who had the bearing of leaders. Caleb focused on Kane's fire. That's where the important information would be. For a while, the men just ate and talked about mundane things, the cold, the quality of their horses, complaints about the food. But as the evening wore on and the bottle made its rounds, the conversation shifted to business. "How many left to clear out?" one of the men asked. He was younger than Kane, lean and hard-eyed, with a jagged scar across his jaw. 4 more homesteads after this one," Kane replied. "Then we're done with this valley. Drummond will have clear title to everything from the North Ridge to Sutter's Creek." "What about the legal challenges?" "Some of these squatters have papers." "Papers don't mean much when the land office records mysteriously disappear," another man said, and they all chuckled darkly at that. "Drummond's got friends in Cheyenne, the kind of friends who know how to lose documents when they need losing." Caleb's jaw tightened. So it wasn't just forged deeds and false claims. Drummond had corrupted the land office itself, destroying legitimate homestead records to make his illegal claims seem legal. It was thorough, systematic, and deeply evil. "What about the mountain man?" the scarred man asked. "The one whose wife just died. He going to be trouble?" Kane was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Hard to say. Man who's lost everything can go 2 ways. Either he breaks, or he gets dangerous. I'm hoping for broke." "We could just burn him out," the scarred man suggested casually. "Make it look like an accident. Grief-stricken widower. Fire gets away from him in the night. Happens." "No." Kane's voice was sharp. "We don't kill unless we have to. Those are Drummond's orders and mine. We intimidate, we pressure, we make staying impossible. But we don't murder homesteaders in their beds. That's a line we don't cross. We crossed it with the wife. Didn't we?" The scarred man's voice was ugly with implication. Kane rounded on him so fast the man flinched back. "That's enough, Reed. You don't know what you're talking about. And you'd best keep your mouth shut about things you weren't part of." But Reed, drunk and stupid, pressed forward. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Woman gets sick, awful, convenient-like, right when she's stirring up trouble among the settlers. And that medicine the doc gave her, well, I heard it came from Drummond's house, not the doctor's office." Kane stood up, his hand on his gun. "I said that's enough. The woman died of fever. If you suggest otherwise again, you'll answer to me." The other two men at the fire moved to intervene, calming Cain down, pulling Reed away toward another fire. But the damage was done. The truth had been spoken aloud, even if Cain wanted to deny it. Sarah had been murdered, and Drummond had ordered it, and some of these men knew it even if they wouldn't admit it openly. Caleb remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, his rage buried beneath years of discipline. He'd suspected Sarah's death was murder, but hearing it confirmed was different. It made everything that followed inevitable. As the argument died down and the camp settled back into routine, Caleb continued his observation. He counted weapons, noted who slept where, identified the guards' rotation patterns. He listened to conversations that revealed these men weren't all cut from the same cloth. Some were hired guns, comfortable with violence. Others were ranch hands, just following orders, uncomfortable with what they'd been asked to do. A few seemed genuinely troubled by the whole business, but too afraid of Drummond to object. One conversation in particular caught his attention. Two older men sitting away from the others, speaking quietly. "I signed on to work cattle, not terrorize families," one said. He was heavy-set, with a graying mustache and sad eyes. "I know it," the other agreed. "But what choice do we have? Drummond owns half the territory. He wants us gone, we're gone, and we'll never find work anywhere. He'll make sure of that. Still don't sit right. That woman we buried today, she was teaching my nephew to read over in the Patterson Valley. Sweet lady, always had a kind word. Now she's dead, and we're throwing her husband off his land. That's not right. Right, don't pay wages." They fell silent after that, and Caleb felt a small measure of satisfaction. Not all of these men were enemies. Some were just trapped by circumstance, following orders because they saw no other choice. That was useful information. It meant potential division, potential allies, or at least men who wouldn't fight too hard when the alternative was death. As midnight approached, Caleb had seen and heard enough. He began his withdrawal, moving as silently as he'd arrived, leaving no trace of his presence. The riders would wake in the morning, never knowing he'd spent the evening cataloguing their weaknesses and listening to their secrets. By the time he reached his cabin, the eastern sky was just beginning to pale with the promise of dawn. He slipped inside and secured the door, then stood for a moment looking around at the home he and Sarah had built. The riders expected him to be broken, to surrender without resistance. Tomorrow, at sunset, they expected him to meekly agree to leave. They were going to be disappointed. Caleb moved to the table where Sarah's journal still lay open. He found a clean page and began writing his own entries. Names of the riders he'd identified, details about their weapons and positions, notes about their divisions and doubts, information about Drummond's corruption of the land office, evidence that could be useful later, if later ever came. But he also wrote something else, letters to each of the homesteader families Sarah had cared about. He wrote in simple, clear language, warning them of Drummond's plans, explaining what had happened to Sarah, urging them to band together rather than face the threat alone. He included details from Sarah's journal about their legal rights, about how to challenge forged deeds, about resources they could access in Cheyenne if they could reach it. He sealed each letter carefully and addressed them. In the morning, if he survived what was coming, he would find a way to get these letters delivered. It was what Sarah would have wanted. Information and organization were power, and he would give the homesteaders every advantage he could provide. As the sun rose over the peaks, painting the snow gold and crimson, Caleb stood on his porch and looked toward the ridge where the riders were stirring. They would come soon, expecting answers. He had answers for them, but not the answers they expected. He touched the rough wood of the door frame, his fingers tracing the carved names, his and Sarah's, permanently etched into the home they'd built together. "Today I keep my promise," he said quietly. "Today I start building what you dreamed of. Forgive me for the path I have to take to get there." The riders were breaking camp now, preparing to ride down and receive his surrender. Caleb went back inside and picked up his rifle, checking the action one final time. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't backing down from one either. Whatever happened next would set the tone for everything that followed. The riders approached mid-morning, moving in the same formation as before, but with less casual confidence. Something about the cabin or the man standing on its porch had changed the atmosphere. Caleb stood exactly where he'd stood yesterday, rifle held loosely at his side, his face calm and unreadable. But the calmness now felt different, less like grief and more like the quiet before a storm. Virgil Kane rode at the front again, but this time he stopped farther back, keeping more distance between himself and Caleb. The other riders spread out, but not as wide as before, staying closer together as if proximity to their fellows might provide some protection against whatever they sensed building. "I'm hoping you've had time to think about our conversation yesterday," Kane called out. He tried to keep his tone reasonable, but there was an edge to it now. "Made a decision about moving on peacefully." "I've thought about it," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the cold morning air. "I've thought about a lot of things. For instance, I've been thinking about how my wife died." Kane shifted in his saddle. "I'm sorry for your loss, like I said, but that's not relevant to the business at hand." "It's very relevant. See, I spent some time last night going through her journal. She kept detailed records of everything happening in this valley. Every threat your men made to homesteader families, every incident of intimidation, every fence cut and every warning delivered. She documented it all very carefully, with dates and names and specific details." Several of the riders exchanged glances. Kane's face remained neutral, but Caleb saw his jaw tighten. "Like I said, we're just enforcing Mr. Drummond's legal rights. She also wrote about the medicine I brought her, how it made her worse instead of better, how she saw a stranger watching our cabin the week before she fell sick." Caleb's voice remained calm, conversational, but each word landed like a stone dropping into still water. "I've been wondering about that medicine, where it really came from, whether someone might have tampered with it. That's a serious accusation." Kane's hand drifted toward his gun belt. "It's just a question. But I heard some interesting things last night that made me think it might not be just a question. I heard someone mention how convenient my wife's death was for Mr. Drummond's plans, how that medicine might have come from Drummond's ranch instead of the doctor's office." The riders went very still. Kane's face showed genuine surprise, then calculation. "You couldn't have heard anything last night. You were here, grieving your wife." "Was I?" Caleb smiled faintly, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Funny thing about grief. Sometimes it makes a man restless. Sometimes it sends him walking in the night, and sometimes those walks take him interesting places. And sometimes, when men are sitting around fires drinking whiskey, they say things they wouldn't say sober." The implication was clear. Somehow, Caleb had been in their camp, had heard their conversations, had moved among them unseen. It should have been impossible, but the specific details he mentioned proved it wasn't. The riders looked around nervously, suddenly aware that the man they'd been sent to intimidate was far more dangerous than they'd imagined. "Now here's what I'm thinking," Caleb continued. "I'm thinking my wife was murdered because she was organizing homesteaders, teaching their children, giving them hope and unity. I'm thinking Mr. Drummond ordered that murder because he saw her as a threat to his land grab. And I'm thinking you men rode up here yesterday, timing your arrival for right when I was burying her, because you thought I'd be too broken to fight back." "We came to enforce a legal deed," Kane said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "You came to finish what the poison started, break me, scatter the homesteaders, and give Drummond control of the whole valley." Caleb's voice remained quiet, but iron had entered it. "That was the plan. It was a good plan. It probably would have worked too, if you were dealing with an ordinary mountain man. But I'm not ordinary, and you're about to find that out." "You threatening us?" One of the younger riders, the one Caleb had heard called Reed, spoke up loudly. 1 man against 20? That's suicide talk. Caleb turned his gaze to Reed, and the young man actually flinched. I spent 20 years as an army scout. I tracked Apache war parties through country they'd lived in for generations. I guided cavalry columns through terrain that killed men who didn't respect it. I survived battles that put better men than you in the ground. So, when I tell you to turn around and ride back to Drummond, you might want to consider that I know exactly what 1 man can do against 20 when he has nothing left to lose. The silence that followed was profound. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, shifting nervously. "I'm going to give you all a choice," Caleb said. "Any man here who wants to ride away right now can do so. I won't stop you. I won't chase you. You can go back to your lives and pretend you were never part of this. But any man who stays, any man who tries to force me off my land or harm the homestead of families my wife cared about, that man becomes my enemy. And I promise you, you don't want me for an enemy." Several of the riders looked at each other, uncertainty plain on their faces. A few actually started to turn their horses, but Kane held up a hand. "Nobody's going anywhere," he said firmly. "We have a job to do, and we're going to do it. Mr. Drummond pays good wages, and he expects results." He looked directly at Caleb. "You've got until sunset to reconsider. After that, we come and get you. Your choice is whether you leave breathing or not." Caleb nodded slowly, as if Kane had just confirmed something he needed to know. "Sunset, then. But I want you to understand something, Kane. I didn't want this. I came to these mountains to leave violence behind. My wife helped me find peace I didn't think was possible for a man like me. And you people murdered her. You took away the only good thing in my life because she taught children to read and gave families hope. So whatever happens at sunset, whatever blood gets spilled, that's on you and Drummond, not on me." He turned and walked back into his cabin, closing the hand-carved door behind him. Through the window, he watched the riders retreat to their camp on the ridge. Some of them were arguing, gesturing animatedly. Others just looked scared. Good. They should be scared, because Caleb Thorne had made his wife a promise, and he intended to keep it no matter what it cost. The hours between morning and sunset felt both endless and too short. Caleb spent them preparing, not for surrender but for war. He moved through the cabin methodically, gathering everything that might be useful. Extra ammunition, his hunting knife, strips of dried venison, a canteen filled with water. He checked his weapons again, loaded and ready. But he also spent time with Sarah's belongings. He read more of her journal, absorbing her words, her dreams, her careful documentation of the Valley families. He held her shawl and breathed in the fading scent of her. He stood before their wedding photograph, the one a traveling photographer had taken 2 years ago, and traced the outline of her smile. "I wish there was another way," he said to her image. "I wish I could fight this with lawyers and laws, the way you would have wanted. But they've corrupted the system. They've murdered you, and they'll murder the dream you had for this valley unless someone stops them. And I'm the only someone available." The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness. From the window, Caleb could see the riders preparing. They'd brought out more weapons, were checking rifles and pistols, organizing themselves into what looked like an assault formation. Whatever uncertainty some of them had shown that morning had been overruled. Kane had given his orders, and the men would follow them. Around 3 in the afternoon, Caleb saw something unexpected, a rider approaching from the east, alone, moving fast. The man wasn't part of Kane's group. He wore different clothes, rode a better horse, and carried himself with an authority that made even Kane come to attention when he arrived at the camp. Caleb couldn't hear their conversation from this distance, but he could read body language. The new arrival was giving orders, and Kane was objecting. The argument went on for several minutes, growing more heated, until finally Kane turned away in obvious frustration, and the new arrival rode down toward the cabin. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, wearing an expensive coat and riding a magnificent black horse. He stopped 30 feet from the cabin and called out, "Mr. Thorne, my name is Marcus Drummond. I'd like to speak with you." So the man himself had come. That was interesting. It suggested either supreme confidence or genuine concern about how this situation was developing. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, but pointed down. "You've got nothing to say that I want to hear," Caleb said. "I think I do." Drummond dismounted, showing either bravery or foolishness. "I've come to make you an offer, a generous one. The way you made my wife a generous offer? The medicine you had tampered with?" Drummond's expression flickered. Surprise, then something colder. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your wife died of fever, according to my information." "Your information is wrong. Your information is a lie you told yourself to justify murder." Caleb's voice was hard as stone. "But I didn't expect you to admit it. Men like you never do. You hide behind money and hired guns and lawyers, pretending your hands are clean. I came here to offer you compensation," Drummond said, ignoring the accusation. $5,000 to leave peacefully. That's more money than you'd see in 10 years of trapping. Take it. Start over somewhere else. Forget about this valley. You can't buy me off. Then what do you want? Justice? Revenge? Drummond's tone turned mocking. You think you can get either of those? I own the territorial marshal. I own the judges in 3 counties. I have 50 men who'll swear you attacked them first, forced us to defend ourselves. Whatever you do here today, the official record will say you were the aggressor, the criminal, the man who got what he deserved. I don't care about the official record. Then what do you care about? Drummond spread his hands. Be reasonable. You can't win this. You're one man against my organization. Even if you kill every man on that ridge, and you won't, I'll just send more. And more after that. You'll never be safe, never be left alone. Is that the life you want? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying the man who'd ordered his wife's death. Marcus Drummond looked prosperous and powerful, a man used to getting what he wanted. But underneath the expensive clothes and confident manner, Caleb saw something else. Fear, just a trace of it, carefully hidden, but there nonetheless. Drummond was afraid of what might happen here, afraid of something beyond hired guns and legal corruption. And then Caleb understood. You're not just here to make me an offer, you're here because you're worried about what I know, about what Sarah documented in her journal, about evidence that could bring down your whole operation if it reached the right people. Drummond's face went very still. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Sarah kept records, names, dates, specific threats, proof that you've been using forged deeds and corrupted land office records, evidence that could interest the federal marshals, the ones you don't own yet. That's what really brought you here. You want to make sure that evidence disappears along with me. You're inventing conspiracy theories. Caleb reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. This is a letter I wrote this morning. It's addressed to the Federal Marshal's office in Denver. It describes everything that's happened here, everything Sarah documented, everything your men said around their campfires last night. I've also enclosed pages from Sarah's journal as proof. He held up the letter, letting Drummond see it clearly. I've already arranged for this letter to be delivered, if anything happens to me. You kill me, you destroy the cabin, you try to cover this up, and that letter goes out. The federal government starts investigating, and once they start looking, they're going to find all the corruption you've buried in Cheyenne, all the homestead records you've destroyed, all the families you've terrorized. It was a bluff. Caleb hadn't arranged for any such delivery. But Drummond didn't know that, and the fear in his eyes deepened as he calculated the implications. You're lying, Drummond said, but he didn't sound certain. Maybe. But are you willing to bet your empire on that? Because once federal marshals start asking questions, once newspapers start writing stories about murdered homesteaders and corrupted land offices, your whole operation comes apart. You might own local judges, but you don't own everyone. And truth has a way of spreading once it gets loose. Drummond's jaw worked as he thought through his options. Caleb could see the calculation happening, the weighing of risks and benefits. Kill Caleb and potentially trigger federal investigation, or let him live and deal with a dangerous witness. Neither option was good, which was exactly what Caleb wanted. Uncertainty was a weapon too. "What do you want?" Drummond finally asked. "Name your price." "Everyone has a price. I want you to leave the homesteaders alone, all of them. I want you to return any land you've taken through forged deeds. I want you to stop corrupting the land office and let legitimate claims stand. And I want you to face justice for what you did to my wife." Drummond laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You want me to destroy myself? That's not negotiation, that's fantasy. Then we don't have anything to negotiate about. You're condemning yourself to death. You know that, right? Even if your bluff about the letter is real, even if you bring federal attention down on me, you'll still be dead. My men will kill you, and whatever satisfaction you get will be cold comfort in your grave." "Maybe," Caleb agreed calmly. "But I made my wife a promise. I swore I'd protect the families she cared about and build the community she dreamed of. I intend to keep that promise, whether I live to see it or not. That's the difference between you and me. You care about power and profit. I care about honoring the word I gave to a woman worth 1,000 of you." Drummond stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "You're a fool, a sentimental fool, throwing his life away for nothing. Not for nothing. For everything that mattered to her. That's not nothing." Drummond turned and walked back to his horse, mounting with sharp, angry movements. "I gave you a chance. I offered you a way out. Remember that when my men come for you. Remember you could have walked away rich and alive. And you remember this," Caleb called after him. "Sarah Thorne was worth more than all your land and money combined. She taught children to read and gave families hope and built something beautiful in this valley. You murdered her because you were afraid of what she represented. And that fear was justified, because her dream is going to outlive you." Drummond didn't respond. He spurred his horse and rode back up to the ridge, and Caleb could imagine the furious orders he was giving Cain. No more negotiation, no more chances. Just violence and death, and the crushing of resistance. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks now, painting the snow in shades of fire and blood. Caleb went back into his cabin and stood before Sarah's grave through the window. "He came himself," Caleb said quietly. "That's how worried he is about what you documented. You really did scare him, love. You and your books and your careful records. You built something he couldn't buy or intimidate or corrupt, and he knows it." He picked up his rifle and checked it one final time. "Now comes the hard part, the part where I make good on my promise. Forgive me for what I'm about to do. Forgive me for becoming again the man I was before you, taught me there was another way. But this is the only language men like Drummond understand." The sun touched the peaks, and on the ridge the riders began to move. The riders came down from the ridge in 3 groups, spreading wide to surround the cabin from multiple angles. It was a professional approach, the kind trained soldiers would use, and it confirmed what Caleb had suspected about Cain's background. The man had military experience and was applying it methodically. Caleb watched from the window, tracking their movements, counting numbers. 18 men. 2 must have left, either from fear or conscience. The ones who remained were committed, or at least paid well enough to override their doubts. They moved carefully, using the terrain for cover, advancing in coordinated bounds, while others provided covering positions. But they were also making mistakes. Small ones, but mistakes nonetheless. They assumed Caleb would stay in the cabin, would fight from a defensive position like any sensible man would. They assumed wrong. Caleb had spent the afternoon preparing the cabin for what was coming. He'd hung extra coats and hats in the windows, positioned to cast shadows that might be mistaken for a man moving inside. He'd left a lamp burning on the table, clearly visible, suggesting his location. He'd even propped open the bedroom door at an angle that created a sightline through both front and back windows, a tempting shot for any sniper. But Caleb wasn't in the cabin. He was in the forest 50 yards behind it, concealed in a small depression he'd scouted weeks ago while hunting. From here, he could see 3 sides of his property and had clear shots at multiple approach routes. More importantly, no one approaching the cabin would think to watch this position because conventional wisdom said a defender stayed with his fortress. The first group of riders reached the tree line in front of the cabin. They dismounted and began moving forward on foot, rifles ready, using trees for cover. Their attention was fixed on the windows, watching for movement, waiting for Caleb to make himself a target. The second group swung wide to approach from the north side, moving through deeper snow but gaining a different angle. The third group stayed mounted, positioned as a reserve force that could respond to wherever Caleb showed himself. Cain was with the mounted group, directing the operation with hand signals. He was patient, careful, not rushing his men into danger. It was the right tactical approach, and if Caleb had been in the cabin, it would have worked perfectly. They would have surrounded him, forced him into a position where resistance was suicide, and ended this with overwhelming firepower. But Caleb had learned long ago that the best defense wasn't holding ground. It was never being where your enemy expected you to be. The first group reached the cabin's front porch. 3 men, moving low and fast, rifles up and ready. One of them kicked open the door, while the other 2 provided cover. They burst inside, shouting, clearing corners the way soldiers were trained to do. The cabin was empty except for Sarah's belongings and the carefully arranged decoys. The men emerged looking confused, signaling to Cain that the target wasn't where he should be. That's when Caleb made his first move. He'd positioned himself with a clear shot at the mounted reserve, and he'd chosen his target carefully. Not Cain, not yet. Instead, he aimed at the man next to Cain, a younger rider named Reed, who'd spoken so casually about burning homesteaders out of their cabins. The Winchester cracked once, sharp and clear in the cold air. Reed fell from his horse, clutching his shoulder, screaming. The sound echoed off the peaks, and for a moment everyone froze, trying to locate where the shot had come from. Caleb was already moving, sliding backward through the depression, relocating before return fire could find him. He counted to 5, emerged 30 yards from where he'd fired, and took another shot. This one clipped a rider's horse, sending it bucking and throwing its rider hard into the snow. The riders reacted with professional speed, diving for cover, returning fire toward where they thought Caleb might be. Bullets kicked up snow and bark, but Caleb was already gone again, moving through terrain he knew better than his own hands. "He's not in the cabin," someone shouted. "He's in the trees behind us." Cain's voice cut through the confusion. "Form up, defensive positions, watch your backs." But forming defensive positions was exactly what Caleb wanted. Defensive positions were static, predictable. They turned hunters into targets. He circled wide, using the forest and his knowledge of the ground, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. Another shot, and a man who'd been moving to flank went down with a leg wound. Not fatal, but enough to take him out of the fight. Caleb wasn't trying to kill these men. Not yet. He was trying to break their confidence, make them understand that their numbers didn't matter when they couldn't see their enemy. There, east side. A rider fired into the trees, spraying bullets wildly. But Caleb was already south, taking aim at another target. He chose his shots carefully, each one precise, each one designed to wound rather than kill. Some of these men were just following orders, just working for wages. They didn't deserve to die for Drummond's ambition, but they needed to understand that staying here meant pain and fear. The 4th man went down. This one shot clean through the hand as he raised his rifle. He dropped the weapon, screaming, clutching his mangled fingers. His companions dragged him behind cover, but the damage was done. 4 men wounded in less than 5 minutes, and none of them had even seen their attacker. "Fall back to the horses," Cain ordered, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Regroup." The riders began retreating, moving in coordinated pairs, covering each other. It was the right decision tactically, but it also meant admitting that their assault had failed. They'd come to drive out one man, and instead found themselves outmatched by his skill and terrain knowledge. Caleb let them go, watching from concealment as they pulled back to their original camp position. 4 men were wounded, being tended to by their companions. The others looked shaken, talking in low voices, gesturing toward the trees where death had come from unseen. But Caleb wasn't done. He circled even wider, coming around to where they'd left their horses. The animals were nervous from the gunfire, stamping and pulling at their tethers. Caleb moved among them like a shadow, cutting lead ropes, opening saddlebags, removing ammunition and supplies. He took only what he needed and left the rest scattered in the snow. But he made sure they saw what he'd done, made sure they understood that even their safe positions weren't safe from him. He was in their camp, among their supplies, invisible and untouchable. When he was finished, he withdrew back into the forest and circled around to a high point where he could observe the riders without being seen. They discovered what he'd done and were arguing among themselves. Some wanted to leave immediately, convinced they were dealing with something beyond their capability. Others, pride or fear of Drummond stronger than fear of Caleb, wanted to continue the assault. Cain was trying to hold his force together, but Caleb could see the foreman's confidence had been badly shaken. He'd lost control of the situation, and everyone knew it. Then something happened that Caleb hadn't anticipated. Drummond himself came riding up from where he'd been watching from a distance. The rancher was furious, gesturing wildly, clearly berating Cain for the failed assault. The argument grew heated, with Cain trying to explain the tactical situation, while Drummond refused to accept that one man could defeat 18. Caleb could have shot Drummond right then. The range was long but makeable, and the man was standing in the open like he believed his wealth made him bulletproof. But Caleb held his fire. Killing Drummond this way would solve nothing. It would make Caleb a murderer in the eyes of the law, would bring more riders seeking revenge, would turn him from victim defending his home into outlaw running for his life. No, Drummond needed to face justice, not execution. Sarah would have wanted that. She'd believed in law and civilization, in solving problems through truth rather than violence. Caleb had promised to honor her memory, and that meant doing this right. Instead, Caleb waited until Drummond finished his tirade and rode away. Then he settled in to watch the riders, to see what they'd do next. If they had any sense, they'd leave, report back to Drummond that the job couldn't be done without serious bloodshed. But Caleb suspected pride and paycheck would keep at least some of them here. As darkness fell, the riders built up their fires and tended their wounded. They'd positioned guards more carefully this time, men watching the forest with rifles ready. But even with precautions, Caleb could see the fear in how they moved, how they stayed close to the fires, how they jumped at small sounds. He'd broken their confidence. They'd come here expecting an easy job, intimidating one grieving man. Instead, they'd found a tactician who knew the ground, who could hit them from anywhere, who turned their numbers from advantage into liability. But Caleb also knew this couldn't continue indefinitely. He'd wounded 4 men, but hadn't driven the others away. Sooner or later they'd regroup, come up with a better plan, maybe bring in more men. He needed to end this decisively, in a way that would make Drummond think twice about sending anyone else. As the moon rose over the peaks, Caleb began working on the next phase of his plan. He moved through the forest, gathering supplies, setting up positions, preparing for what he knew would have to be the final confrontation. He couldn't sustain a prolonged siege. His ammunition was limited, his options were narrowing, and winter was coming hard to these mountains. Tomorrow would decide everything. Tomorrow would be when he either kept his promise to Sarah or died trying. But either way, Marcus Drummond was going to learn that some men couldn't be bought, threatened or broken, and some promises were worth dying to keep. He spent the night preparing, working by moonlight, setting up his final defense. If the riders came again, they'd find something very different from what they expected. And if they had any sense at all, they'd finally understand that some fights weren't worth winning. The attack came an hour later, coordinated and overwhelming. The riders had split into 4 groups, approaching from all sides simultaneously. They used fire like Caleb had anticipated, throwing torches onto the cabin's roof, trying to smoke him out or burn him alive. But Caleb had spent the night wetting down the roof and walls with snowmelt, treating the wood with water until it was too damp to catch easily. The torches sputtered and died, producing more smoke than flame, and the assault lost its primary advantage. He met them from prepared positions, firing methodically from different locations, making them think there were more defenders than just one man. His shots were precise, calculated to wound rather than kill when possible. A shoulder here, a leg there, enough to take men out of the fight without making this a massacre. But some of the riders were professionals, the kind who'd done this before. They adapted quickly, using covering fire and coordinated movements. They were willing to take casualties to close the distance, and slowly, inexorably, they began to tighten the noose. Caleb fell back to his secondary position, a reinforced area behind the cabin where he had clear sightlines and plenty of ammunition. He could hold here for hours if necessary, but he knew time was his enemy. Eventually his endurance would fail, or he'd make a mistake, or they'd simply overwhelm him through sheer persistence. That's when everything changed. A shot rang out from the forest, but not from Caleb's position. One of the riders attacking from the north went down, clutching his arm. Then another shot, and another rider fell. The attackers spun around, confused, trying to identify this new threat. From the trees emerged figures on horseback, homesteaders. 5 of them, maybe 6, carrying old rifles and shotguns. They weren't professional fighters, but they knew how to shoot, and they were tired of being terrorized. At their head was a tall black man Caleb recognized from Sarah's journal, Isaiah Blackwood, whose family had claimed land 15 miles south. Beside him rode Michael Patterson, the father of the girl Sarah had taught to read. Others he knew by reputation, but had never met. "Figured you could use some help," Blackwood shouted, his voice carrying across the snow. The riders' assault fell apart in confusion. They'd planned for 1 defender, not 6 or 7. Kane tried to maintain order, shouting commands, but his men were breaking. Some fired wildly at the new threat. Others began retreating to their horses. The professional coordination dissolved into chaos. Caleb used the opportunity to press his advantage. He emerged from his position, rifle up, and fired 2 quick shots that sent riders diving for cover. The homesteaders advanced from their side, not trying to kill, but making it clear they were willing to fight. "Hold your fire!" It was Kane's voice, desperate now. "Everyone hold fire!" The shooting tapered off into an uneasy standoff. The riders were scattered, disorganized, caught between 2 forces. Several were wounded, being dragged to safety by their companions. The rest looked at Kane for direction, but the foreman seemed to have run out of directions to give. Into the silence rode Marcus Drummond again, fury written across his face. He'd been watching from a distance, certain his superior numbers would prevail. The arrival of the homesteaders had ruined everything. "You're all trespassing on my land," Drummond shouted at the homesteaders. "Get off my property or face legal consequences." "This ain't your land," Isaiah Blackwood said calmly. "These are legitimate homesteads, filed proper and legal. We got the papers to prove it. Your papers are worthless." "The land office records might have disappeared," Blackwood interrupted. "But we made copies, sent them to Denver to the federal marshal's office, along with documentation of all your threats, all your intimidation, all your lies. Sarah Thorne taught us to do that. She taught us to protect ourselves with truth and law." Drummond's face went pale. "You're bluffing." "No, sir, we're not." Michael Patterson spoke up, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. "Sarah spent 3 months helping us organize, showing us how to document everything, explaining our rights. She knew men like you would come eventually. Caleb felt something break open in his chest. Sarah hadn't just taught children to read. She'd armed the homesteaders with knowledge, with organization, with the tools to fight back legally. Her work had been more comprehensive, more strategic than he'd realized. She'd been building a community capable of defending itself, and that community had just arrived to prove her vision was real. "We're not here for a fight," Blackwood continued. "We're here to stand witness, to make sure whatever happens here today gets reported accurately, and to make sure Caleb Thorne doesn't stand alone the way you wanted him to." Drummond looked around at his scattered riders, at the homesteaders watching from the trees, at Caleb standing beside Sarah's grave with his rifle still ready. The rancher's grand plan to seize the valley had come apart, undone by one woman's quiet work, teaching and organizing families he'd dismissed as too poor and ignorant to resist. "This isn't over," Drummond said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes," Caleb said quietly, "it is." 6 months later, spring arrived in the valley like a promise kept. The snow melted from the meadows, revealing green grass and wildflowers. The creek ran high and clear, fed by snowmelt from the peaks. Elk returned to their summer grazing grounds, and the air filled with birdsong that had been absent during the long winter. Caleb stood beside Sarah's grave, which was no longer alone in the small clearing. He'd built a fence around it, white painted wood that caught the morning sun. Wildflowers grew inside the fence, the same kind Sarah used to press in her journal. He'd planted them carefully in the spring thaw, and now they bloomed in purple and yellow and white. But today he wasn't alone. Behind him, gathered in the meadow, were nearly 40 people, homesteader families from across the valley, dressed in their best clothes despite the long rides they'd made to get here. Children ran between the adults, laughing and playing, free from the fear that had shadowed them all winter. They'd come for a dedication ceremony, not for Sarah's grave, though many would pay their respects there. They'd come for the building that now stood at the edge of the meadow, a solid log structure with large windows and a covered porch. Above the door hung a hand-carved sign, Sarah's Hope School. The building had taken 3 months to construct, with every homesteader family contributing labor and materials. It was simple but well built, with a stone fireplace for winter heat, rows of benches for students, and shelves already filling with books. Some of the books had been Sarah's, carefully preserved from the cabin. Others had been donated by families from as far away as Cheyenne, who'd heard the story of the teacher who died protecting her students' future. Isaiah Blackwood walked over to stand beside Caleb. The tall man's presence had become familiar over the past months, a friendship built through shared struggle and mutual respect. "She'd be proud," Blackwood said simply. "This is exactly what she wanted." "It's just a start," Caleb replied, "but it's a good start." The legal battles had been long and complicated, but the homesteaders had prevailed. The documentation Sarah had compiled, combined with the copies sent to federal authorities, had triggered an investigation into the Territorial Land Office. Corruption had been exposed, officials had been arrested, and Marcus Drummond had been indicted on multiple counts of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy. The rancher was currently awaiting trial in Cheyenne, his empire crumbling around him. His riders had scattered, with several turning states' evidence in exchange for leniency. Virgil Kane, surprisingly, had been one of them. The old foreman had testified about Drummond's orders, about the poison used to murder Sarah, about the systematic campaign to drive homesteaders from their land. It wouldn't bring Sarah back. Nothing could do that. But it meant her death had not been in vain, and it meant the families she'd cared about were safe. That was something. It was enough. "Folks are waiting for you to speak," Blackwood said gently. "You ready?" Caleb nodded and walked toward the school. The crowd parted to let him through, faces turned toward him with expressions of respect and gratitude. He climbed the 3 steps to the porch and turned to face them. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "My wife was the one with the words, the one who could inspire people and make them believe in better futures. But she's not here, so I'll do my best. He paused, gathering his thoughts, feeling the weight of all those eyes upon him. Sarah came to this valley 3 years ago, planning to teach at a settlement that barely existed. Instead, she found something better. She found families who were building lives in hard country, raising children and creating homes. She saw potential where others saw only wilderness. A few people nodded, remembering. Michael Patterson's daughter, little Emma, stood near the front holding her father's hand. She was reading chapter books now, Sarah's final student and first success. She taught your children to read and write, but more than that, she taught them to think, to question, to believe they could be more than circumstances dictated. She taught them that education was power, that knowledge was freedom, that community was strength. And she documented everything, built a case against those who would destroy what you were building, prepared you to defend yourselves with truth and law. His voice grew stronger, more certain. Men came with guns and threats, with money and lawyers, thinking they could take what you'd built. They thought power was measured in acres and dollars. Sarah taught us that real power is measured in books read and promises kept, and communities that stand together. And she was right. The crowd was silent, listening. Even the children had gone still, sensing the importance of the moment. This school carries her name because it carries her dream. Every child who learns to read here, every family that finds strength here, every act of community that happens here, that's Sarah living on. That's her promise kept. And as long as this school stands, as long as children gather here to learn, she'll never really be gone. He looked back at the building, at the sign above the door, at the open windows that let spring breeze flow through. I made her a promise when she was dying. I swore I'd protect the families she cared about and build the community she envisioned. Today we're making good on that promise together. This school is just the beginning. There will be more families, more children, more learning. This valley will be what she believed it could be. A place where people help each other survive and thrive, where every child gets a chance to reach their potential, where justice and community matter more than power and greed. He stepped down from the porch and walked to where a ribbon had been strung across the door. Isaiah Blackwood handed him a knife, and Caleb cut the ribbon with one clean stroke. Sarah's Hope School is open. The crowd cheered, and children rushed forward to explore their new schoolhouse. Parents followed, examining the benches and books, already planning schedules and lessons. The valley had found its future, and it looked bright. Caleb walked back to Sarah's grave, away from the celebration. He stood beside the white fence, looking at the wildflowers, feeling the spring sun warm on his face. "We did it, love," he said softly. "Your dream is real. The children will learn. The families will thrive. The community you built will last." He touched the rough wood of the fence, wood he'd shaped with his own hands. "I kept my promise. I hope that wherever you are, you know that. I hope you're proud." A breeze moved through the pines, carrying the sound of children's laughter from the school. Caleb closed his eyes and listened, and for just a moment he could almost hear Sarah's voice among them, teaching and encouraging and building something beautiful that would outlast them all. He turned and walked back toward the school, toward the community, toward the future Sarah had believed in. He wasn't just a grieving widower anymore. He was a member of something larger, something worth fighting for, something that made the hard winter and the promises and the pain mean something. The mountain man had found his purpose in her promise, and the valley had found its hope in her dream.